Welcome back to the Say It Louder podcast, where we speak the unspeakable and encourage victims to reclaim their voice. I am your host, Selena Waterman-Smith. This is episode 2 of the Say It Louder podcast, and I'm going to drive straight back into where we left off from last time, which is talking through the police investigation in Dubai after I was a victim of kidnap and gang rape. So at this stage, I only know that an investigation has started. I'm still recovering mentally from trauma. I'm in extreme shock. And every few days, I receive a phone call from the police telling me that I need to come to the police station or I need to come to the court. And there was never any context to these phone calls. It was always a phone call from a random person identifying me and then saying, you need to come to this location at this time. And because of the fear about what happens to rape victims in the UAE, I was always frightened that something bad was going to happen to me when I showed up. So I was constantly living in this state of fear as well as trying to cope with the trauma. And on one of these occasions, not long after the assault, I was called down to the police station and with no warning was told that I was there to do an identity parade, which absolutely terrified me. The thought of having to see these men up close, and I had no one with me and I had no time to mentally prepare, and the police did tell me, the CID officers told me, they will not be able to see you, they'll be behind a screen. It's exactly like you see in films and TV shows where there's glass that they can't see through but you can see them. And there were about 6 Arabic men stood in a line, all different shapes and sizes, in this room, and I didn't want to do it. I physically could not step foot in the room. I started crying and shaking, and the police officers had to coerce me to go into the room. I wish there'd been a female officer there, but female officers, especially in those types of cases, are non-existent. So I had to go and do this identity parade, and I didn't recognize any of the men. I didn't have enough memory to recognize any of them. And when we left, I went back out into the waiting room and one of the CID officers gave me a glass of water, and he told me that they'd got these men in 6 hours. And again, no one had even notified me that they'd found these men or arrested them. To say that you're kept in the dark by the UAE legal system when you're a victim of something is a massive understatement. No one informed me about anything. I didn't know their names, their nationalities. I didn't know how they found them. They just popped up that day and said, hey, we want you to do an identity parade. And then the police officer let me know that they'd found them within 6 hours. I didn't know how. And that they'd already confessed. So it seemed as though this case was almost, we knew what the result was going to be, even though it still had to go to trial and the subsequent court case went on for over a year. And then that CID officer let another bombshell slip. And this is one of the reasons why I think my case was taken seriously. He told me that when they recovered their mobile phones, they had countless victims, and they had footage and recordings of other sexual assaults from women that they had kidnapped. And he was quite blasé about it. He said, yeah, lots of women, Indian, Filipino, like this. Just dropped it into conversation. And I was really, cannot tell you how gobsmacked I was that these men had not done this opportunistically. They were a prolific rape gang that were intentionally going out. This was their MO on the weekend, looking for victims, drugging women, kidnapping them and raping them. And they had done this to so many other women. And I wondered if those women had tried to report it and if they had been treated the same way that I had by the police, and maybe that had been enough to intimidate them into not making a statement. Maybe they weren't as persistent as I was. Maybe they were arrested. Maybe they were persecuted themselves as victims. And again, because I'm a British national, maybe my case was taken seriously, because it could have looked really bad for the UAE if that got into the papers that British women are being kidnapped and gang raped in Dubai. And if there's ever a use for white privilege, it's that. Because suddenly this case wasn't just about me and about my own sexual assault. It was about all these other women that were voiceless, that had potentially gone through this horrific trauma. Maybe they didn't survive. Maybe they'd unalived them. Maybe they hadn't recovered mentally from their trauma. Maybe they'd left the UAE and gone to their home countries and they never got justice. So I felt I had this huge responsibility on my shoulders to not just get justice for myself, but to get justice for all these other women. And also to make sure that these rapists, these scumbags, were off the streets. They are a risk to women. They're predatory, they're dangerous, they're causing severe harm to female victims. And there was no way in hell that I was going to let them get away with this. And I think it was at this police station visit that the British Embassy showed up. And I have no idea who called them, because I certainly didn't. And the lady from the embassy burst into the police room, and she was horrified that I had reported it. She took me to the side. She said, "You need to get out of here. You need to leave the country immediately." And I was thinking, what do you mean I need to leave the country? I was really perplexed because the investigation was moving forward. I hadn't been arrested as a rape victim. And she said, "We, the British Embassy, strongly advise that if you have been raped in the UAE, you do not report it, you do not go to the authorities, you simply leave the country without saying anything." And it actually used to say on the British government website that if you travel to the UAE and you're a victim of sexual assault, they strongly advise that you do not report it, you leave the country. It doesn't say that anymore, but the situation is still the same. Victims are arrested and usually persecuted. So this lady from the British Embassy was telling me that I should drop the case and I should leave, but I'm generally quite a determined person at the best of times. And I also wanted to see justice be done for myself and for these other victims. I felt like I had a responsibility. And if there was potential risk involved in that, if there was a risk to me that I would be arrested as a rape victim, I was prepared to take that risk. Because I also kind of refused to believe that I lived in a world where rape victims are arrested. And I know that has happened to other women, but I was just following my own truth and my own model of the world. And I absolutely was not prepared to accept any outcome that didn't result in a conviction against these men. So while all of this was going on, while I was dealing with ongoing and regular communication with the police and being summoned to various stations and the court at the drop of a hat, a newspaper article was released in the British press about this case. And my name was protected worldwide with anonymity by law. Rape victims' names are not allowed to be published. However, that didn't stop them from publishing the most damaging and highly defamatory story about me in the case. And I never know if the UAE released this version of events to make themselves look better and to make the circumstances look better on their part, or if it was just something salacious that the newspaper themselves had invented. But the narrative entirely focused on a scenario where a drunk woman went out by herself to get drunk, was in a bar alone, buying lots of drinks, and then got into a taxi and tried to go home, but couldn't afford to pay for the taxi because this drunk woman was of such poor character that not only was she drinking alone like an alcoholic, but she also didn't have the 50 dirhams that she needed to pay her fare. And that these good Samaritans had stopped over by the side of the road and said that they would take responsibility for this woman because they're such good guys, these men, right? And they also offered to pay my fare. They gave the taxi driver money, and then they took me home. And then there was a lot of story around how the bar that I was in was really seedy and notorious for cheap alcohol deals, and they had a popcorn machine and all sorts of details that just made it sound so seedy and gross. And bearing in mind, I'd never been to this bar before and I wasn't there out drinking. I literally popped in there to deliver some keys to someone or pick up keys. But even if that version of events was true, this was my first experiences of societal bias against victims and how quick society is to blame the victim. How any circumstance can be utilized and manipulated as a way that makes the victim responsible and somehow exonerates the victim, somehow exonerates the criminals. And at the end of this story, which portrayed this woman in this horrific light, it said, the two lines at the end, it said the names of the men that had been charged, and it said they'd been charged with kidnapping and rape. Reading that story was re-traumatizing for me as a victim. And this is why we talk about re-traumatization for victims, because it's bad enough that you go through the experience. Then you're quite often traumatized again when you have to report the crime and you have to deal with people not believing you. Then there might be media coverage in which you're persecuted as a victim. There's the social stigma, and your friends and family will turn against you. And if you're a sexual assault victim by somebody famous, you might have to deal with their fans coming after you and persecuting you. So it's just this avalanche of horrendous things happening one after the other. And I was so hysterical when I read that story. And then, of course, I read the comments, which you should never do when you read any sort of British newspaper. And the comments were saying things like, oh, well, she should learn her lesson and she shouldn't go out and get that drunk. You know, hopefully she'll think better next time about going out by herself and getting drunk. And I want to stress this again. That's not the scenario, and that's not what happened to me. I was not out drinking by myself. But even if a victim is out drinking, or they are inebriated, or they are in a taxi falling asleep because they're too drunk, that is not an excuse for rape. And I'm such a strong advocate against victim blame. It's why I've started this podcast. It's why I've written this book. It's why I challenge this status quo on all of my social media platforms, because it is unacceptable to re-traumatize a victim. There is no excuse for rape. A woman's consent can be withdrawn at any point. And in my circumstances, consent was never given. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that, judging by that story, the fact that the men were charged with kidnap and rape means that they were not good Samaritans that just happened to be behind the taxi. They had followed me from the bar. They had spiked my drink. They had dragged me from that taxi, and the taxi driver was complicit because he just let me go. And the fact that I didn't even know these details until I read the newspaper report, because the UAE authorities didn't keep me in the loop, it was just trauma after trauma. I honestly don't know how I survived those first few months. And things again escalated, as they so often do in that part of the world, and they got worse. On another occasion where I was asked to go down to the court, I had a random phone call. I was asked to go down to the court, possibly 4 or 5 months after the initial assault had happened. And unlike the times when I was working with CID and I felt that they were kindly, professional, but detached, the situation when I arrived at the Dubai courts was extremely hostile. I was in a small room with 8 or 9 Arabic men in full Arabic dress, and it became obvious that the purpose of this meeting was to castigate me and chastise me as a victim. And I wonder now, looking back, if there were 2 different authorities in conflict with each other in the UAE. The one part of the Dubai authority that wanted to get this case resolved, possibly because they know that British women being kidnapped in Dubai isn't great PR, and Dubai values its reputation above all things. And then there was this other faction that loves to arrest rape victims and charge them and put them in jail. And maybe these men had been denied this opportunity to do this on this occasion, so they had to get something on me. So this different group of men in the court, I don't know if they're prosecutors or judges, instead of looking at this case and thinking, wow, this girl has been a victim of something horrendous and she's been very brave by coming forward and reporting the crime, and we also want rapists off the streets. Instead, they'd combed through my statement looking for anything that they could possibly use to undermine me or put pressure on me as a victim. So when I walked into this room, they said, "Here's your statement." They held it up. And some of them were talking in Arabic behind me. I felt very intimidated. I'm a woman on my own in this big group of men. And the guy said, "Oh, you drink alcohol in the UAE? This is disrespectful. How dare you disrespect the UAE? This is illegal." And I was quite baffled because, yes, I had a glass of wine while I was in the bar, which is a licensed venue. Technically, in somewhere like Dubai, you need a license to drink alcohol at home. But if you're in a licensed venue, then that's covered under the licensing. But no, these men had decided that that was wrong. And I then had to spend 20 or 30 minutes in this room with them being berated about what a terrible person I was. I'm disrespecting the UAE. I've broken the law. How dare I should leave the country. And perhaps they also wanted me to leave. Perhaps this was also part of the pressure to drop my case. I don't know. I was baffled. And I stuck up for myself and I said I was in a licensed venue when I drank this glass of wine. and I don't understand how I've done anything wrong. And the outcome of this conversation was that these men decided that they were going to give me a fine for about 165 British pounds and that I had to go and pay it, which was again baffling. There was no criminal charge against me. There was no court case. There's nothing in the system. I have no criminal record for drinking alcohol. But I should have been more wary then of men that have such unchecked power. The fact that they could just make up a complaint, they could fabricate a complaint against me out of thin air, and they had such power that they were able to put a fine in the system against my name purely on a whim, purely because they felt like it, and that their priority was not helping me get justice, was not applauding my bravery for coming forward. It was that they had to find a way to persecute a woman. And they were prepared to fabricate laws and bend things to their will in order to make that happen. So I left the court. But what I didn't realise, because of course they didn't tell me, was that they'd also enacted a travel ban against me, which shouldn't be possible without a criminal charge or a court case or any sort of complaint against my name. They'd actually given me a travel ban, which I didn't find out about until a few weeks later. I was on a work trip to Qatar. I was flying there for an event with more than 10 people that worked for me, and I was actually detained at the airport and taken to a police station. And again, when I got to the police station, the officer in charge just released me immediately, and he was quite sheepish. And I wonder if that's, again, an example of how these two different factions were at war with each other, because one department wanted to persecute me and the other wanted to keep me safe and wanted to see this case through to its resolution. So the whole thing was a storm in a teacup. I have no idea why they gave me a travel ban or why they just released me and they then dropped the travel ban. But this is a prime example of how dangerous Dubai is, especially for women, and how the law is not black and white. It's not concrete. It's not set in stone. It's whatever the men in power decide it is on that particular day. And if you fall foul of powerful men in that part of the world, you're in big trouble. So these experiences were not only re-traumatizing, but it was my first experience of how societal bias is geared against victims and how society will look for any opportunity to blame a victim for being a victim of rape, which is just mind-blowing to me. And it's why I'm so outspoken against it and why I advocate for victims. And even to a lesser extent, one of my friends who drifted away from me, as so many of my friends did back in 2012, and she told me that she'd had a conversation with her boyfriend about my experience and that he'd said, "She sounds like the kind of girl that gets herself in trouble and you should stay away from her." And that really just sums up people's attitudes towards rape victims. So I felt pretty isolated and alone, and I don't know where I got the strength to carry on, because the court case went on until the next year. In fact, it was nearly an entire year before the whole thing was resolved. And there was more to come. So I think that's all we've got time for in this week's episode. Episode 3 will be dropping next week. There'll be an episode of this every week, and I'll be going into detail in next week's episode about the trial and about the further details that came out about what happened to me that night and how they were so extreme. So if this was helpful to you, if you support me on my healing journey, and if you're perhaps overcoming something traumatic of your own, you can hit subscribe, and you can also sign up to my link in the comments below, and you'll receive emails from me where I'll be sharing healing information and resources, and also bonus chapters from my book. And I really hope that this encourages you to speak out and to reclaim your voice as a victim, and hopefully when you do, you'll say it louder.